Hello, I'm Mark Hewitt, the author of Hunted, the Zodiac Murders. What you're about to hear is the audiobook edition, narrated by Mark Redfield. But before we begin, I wanted to personally thank you for listening and invite you to join me in this exploration of one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Chapter 1, Part 1. Every mystery has a beginning. In 1966, a brutal murder in Riverside, California, shocked the community, but no one knew it was just the first piece of a much larger puzzle. Was this the work of the Zodiac, or something else entirely? Let's begin.
1. Riverside, California. Quote, "She was young and beautiful." End quote. Sherry Joe drove herself to the library. It would be the last ride of her life. At 3 in the afternoon, and again at 3:45, 18-year-old Sherry Joe Bates, a pretty Southern California brunette, telephoned Stephanie Gutman, her close friend and fellow River City College RCC student. She invited her friend to accompany her in picking up a few books from the college library. It was Sunday afternoon, and Sherry Joe, a conscientious first-year student, needed the literature to complete a class assignment. Gutman would forever regret passing on the opportunity. Alone, Bates set out sometime before 6 p.m. on October 30, 1966. Just before she left, she wrote a note for her father, with whom she lived, informing him of her destination. Quote, "Dad, went to RCC Library." End quote. Joseph Bates arrived home shortly afterwards and found his daughter's words. Before he departed for dinner at a friend's home, he too scribbled a note. Stephanie had called and left a message. This father and daughter team communicated well and often. Joseph had phoned Sherry Joe from his friend's home at 5 and again at 5:15 to invite his daughter to join them for dinner, but the line was busy on both occasions. He had just missed her when he got back home around 6 p.m. Joseph showered, changed his clothes, and traveled back to his friend's home. Sherry Joe would have to fend for herself. Earlier that day, the two had celebrated Mass at St. Catherine's Catholic Church, followed by breakfast. When her dad went to the beach at Corona del Mar with his friend to enjoy the unseasonably warm temperatures that afternoon, Sherry Joe had declined to accompany him. She had homework to complete. She also hoped to make time to compose a passionate letter to her boyfriend in San Francisco. When Joseph finally arrived at home to stay around midnight, he discovered that his message remained untouched. A feeling of worry overcame him. Sherry Joe, his only daughter, had not returned from the library. Alarmed, he hurriedly telephoned Gutman for any information he could gather. He would call her again at 6:50 in the morning. At daybreak, he filed a missing persons report with the Riverside Police Department, RPD. He and Sherry Joe were so close, and she was usually so careful and punctual, that he refused to wait any longer. He knew something was wrong. Something was. At 6:30 in the morning, following her disappearance, the body of Sherry Joe Bates was found face down on a dirt pathway that led to a student parking area. It lay between two old vacant houses that had been purchased by the college in preparation for an expansion. Bates' remains were approximately 100 yards from her disabled car. One police estimate lists 200 feet instead of 300 feet, possibly a typing error. The grisly discovery was made by 48-year-old RCC groundskeeper Cleophas Martin as he operated a street sweeping machine. Sherry Joe had been stabbed numerous times, including a coup de grace to the neck, a slice that nearly decapitated her. The furrowed grass in the area bore witness to a horrific struggle. Bates was fully clothed in a yellow blouse. The coroner described it as a, quote, "loose pink moderately heavy blouse," end quote, homemade red capris, and white sandals. She wore no sweater because she was planning to return home immediately after collecting the books. She preferred to study at home. Her arms were drawn in, and her body partially concealed a woven straw tote bag purse beneath her, papers from which would be used to identify her. She had been beaten about the face and strangled. The autopsy would detail 7 deliberate cuts to her young throat. Born in Nebraska on February 4, 1948, to Joseph C. Bates and Irene Karolvitz, Sherry Josephine Bates lived with her father, a machinist at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Norco. Her only sibling, her younger brother, Michael, had joined the Navy and was stationed far from home. She could see her mother any time, since she too lived in Riverside, having divorced Sherry Jo's father. The family, which had been intact at the time, had moved to California 8 years prior to the attack. A family of 4, through divorce and a military assignment, had become a household of 2. Her parents' divorce and her brother's absence did not hold Sherry Jo back. She was even-keeled, dedicated, and determined. A full-time student at RCC, she still found time to do typing and other clerical work for Riverside National Bank. She was well liked by her friends, but, more importantly, she was respected by them. Never given to erratic impulses, her word was her bond. Everyone who knew her knew that she was as dependable and prompt as she was loyal. Her creative flair never resulted in periods of irresponsibility. She was generous and kind, and always seemed to have a smile on her face. She had no shortage of date requests from the many men drawn to her gregariousness. She was planning a career as a flight attendant. An official at the Ramona High School, where Bates had been a cheerleader, described her as bright and very popular with both boys and girls during her high school career in Riverside. Riverside, California, the town where Sherry Jo and her family had lived for almost a decade, was founded in 1870. Named for the Santa Ana River on which it sat, it became the county seat in 1873 when Riverside County was established. No permanent settlement had occurred at the site prior to this time, but the area was well known to the local Native Americans, who had, over the years, built many temporary dwellings there. The Spanish first arrived in the region in 1774. Once established as a permanent town and seat of the county, Riverside became known for the Washington Navel orange, a popular variety of seedless orange. It boasted large settlements of Chinese and Korean workers, possessing one of the largest Chinatowns to be found in California. It played host to NASCAR racing and other track events at the Riverside International Raceway that operated from 1957 to 1989. When it finally closed, the raceway's buildings and track were dismantled to make way for a shopping mall. In the 1960 census, the town boasted a population of 84,332. Sherry Jo Bates would never again be counted among the city's residents, however. She had been murdered in cold blood. The 1960s in California was a tumultuous decade. As far as American history, only the 1860s with the Civil War offered more social and cultural upheaval. One consequence of the free love and rebellion was a large number of serial killers spawned in the turbulence of the 1960s and 1970s. They may have emerged on the scene as a result of widespread interpersonal alienation, the increased number of absentee parents, or merely the nebulous but palpable angst that permeated the culture. Whatever the cause, the surge of a new type of criminal was notable and alarming. At the time of Bates' death, no one realized that a lone murder in Southern California was the opening salvo of a deadly spree and the beginning of a decades-long mystery. It was a one-off event when it occurred, and it seemed unrelated to other contemporary crimes. The crime, in and of itself, was high profile, and the community felt an urgency to find its resolution. In the usually safe town of Riverside, murder was rare. Riverside Police Chief L.T. Curley Kincaid quickly assigned 7 officers. They were ordered to drop their current projects and apply themselves full-time to the murder investigation. Detective Sergeant Gren was assisted by 6 detectives: Dick Yonkers, Earl Brown, Wayne Durrington, Cliff Arons, Curtis Best, and Bob Walters. These investigators would in turn be supported by full-time detectives assigned to the case by the district attorney's office and additional detectives from the coroner's office. On the first day of the investigation alone, the day Bates' body was discovered, 24 officers put in a total of 133 man-hours of effort. And this was only the beginning. The first month recorded a total of 30 different law enforcement agents working the many facets of the murder case. Gren, Brown, and Yonkers preserved the integrity of the crime scene and began to search for clues, even as students began to flow past on their way to class. Many stopped to stare. Subsequent investigation revealed that Bates had checked out 3 books on the U.S. Electoral College system from the RCC library at approximately 6 p.m. When she returned to her lime green Volkswagen Beetle, parked on a city street near the library at 3680 Terracina Drive, the address of the college, she was unable to start the vehicle. Apparently, not realizing the damage that had been done to her car, she turned over the engine again and again, enough to drain the battery. 3 library books lay on the passenger seat of her car. The keys remained in the ignition. Under greater scrutiny, it was evident that someone had deliberately tampered with Miss Bates' 1960 Volkswagen. Riverside County Sheriff's deputies Jack Reed and Jack Elms, who located Bates' car on the morning after her disappearance, noted that the distributor coil and condenser had been torn out, and the coil wire dislodged from the distributor socket. A few greasy fingerprints and palm prints that dirtied the driver's door must have come from whoever had disabled the car. Both windows were rolled down. The passenger door was ajar, suggesting to detectives that her assailant may have been in the vehicle with her. Detective Captain Irv L. Cross of the Riverside Police Department, RPD, ordered the vehicle towed to the police station to be examined. Dr. F. Rene Modglin, a pathologist on contract with the Riverside County Coroner's Office, began his preliminary autopsy right at the spot Bates lay. He had been called at home at 7:15 in the morning by Chief Deputy Coroner William J. Dykes and notified of a possible homicide. Dykes called again at 8:30, this time to Modglin at work, ordering him to proceed to the site. The pathologist arrived just after 9 a.m. Based on the temperature of Bates' liver and the corpse's stage of rigor mortis, he tentatively estimated that the girl had been killed at 10:30 p.m. That estimate would be modified following a more extensive study of the body. The detectives gathering clues soon learned that Sherry Joe may have announced her passing. A woman who lived in the vicinity reported that she heard a scream the previous evening between 10:15 p.m. and 10:45 p.m., followed by a second, muted scream, and then, 2 minutes later, by the sound of an older car roaring to life. This information was described in the newspapers as originating from an anonymous caller, who, at the time of the sounds, did not think them important enough to contact the police. Whether these were related to the violent attack was never established. The screams could have come from someone unwittingly stumbling across the body in the dead of night, or by someone unrelated to the crime. If they had been made by Bates, and denoted the time of the attack, investigators were left to wonder what Bates was doing between 6 p.m. and 10:15 p.m., especially in light of the fact that she could not start her car and may have not shown herself to her friends in the library, which shuttered for the night at 9 p.m. The police believed that the screams coincided with Bates' death, but would not confirm this without corroborating evidence. Authorities transported the body to Atchison and Graham Mortuary, where Modglin performed a complete autopsy. Those present included Detective Gerald H. Dunn, Detective Earl T. Brown of the RPD, Investigator Jim Lesine, Riverside County District Attorney's Office, Michael J. Riley, Riverside County Coroner's Office, and Mr. Scotty Hill, an embalmer at the mortuary. The pathologist ruled it a death due to hemorrhage of the right carotid artery. Fingernail scrapings suggested that the victim had struggled against a white male assailant. Bates weighed 110 pounds. The doctor noted her green eyes and brown hair. Her blood type was AB positive and tested negative, as expected, for traces of drugs or alcohol. He recorded, among many other abrasions and wounds, a 2-centimeter oblique laceration to her upper lip, numerous petechia in the skin of her forehead, and an area of dark blue-gray discoloration of the skin of her left cheek and chin. He removed from her stomach the roast beef that had been cooked and eaten by Bates on Sunday, evidencing between 2 and 4 hours of digestion. He now set the time of death to a range of time between 9 p.m. and 1 a.m., but an even earlier time would be stated in a future document. During the preliminary procedure, still at the crime scene, Modglin found a clot of blood with 4 sandy brown hairs attached to it. They were on the base of Bates' right thumb and provided a most intriguing potential forensic link to her killer. Analysis conducted by the Trace Evidence Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, in 1999 revealed that the hairs did not match exemplary hairs taken from Bates. The killer may have deposited the clot during the mortal violence. The wounds on her body revealed that the friendly coed had been attacked with a small knife whose blade measured only 3.5 inches by a half inch, possibly a penknife or a small kitchen implement. She had been stabbed numerous times in the chest, once in the back, and slashed across her neck. Investigators had on their hands a homicide caused by multiple stabbing and slashing wounds of the abdomen and neck, inflicted with a sharp instrument or knife. Despite having no eyewitnesses and no firm time of attack, they remained hopeful that enough clues were present to identify and convict the person or persons responsible. They wanted the case solved. They wanted it solved quickly. Detectives Bob Walters and Earl Brown of the RPD used a metal detector to search the area of the crime scene for a murder weapon. None was found. An investigation of the library also proved fruitless. Walter Siebert was one of a few of Sherry Joe's friends who was at the library from 7:15 p.m. to 9 p.m. None of them saw Bates, whom they knew and would have noticed, according to the police report. Bates' friends did not report that they saw 4 men in work clothes sitting on a fence across from the spot where Bates' car was located. One newspaper reported that Bates had been seen studying at the library until its close at 9 p.m. San Francisco Chronicle reporter Paul Avery later wrote that, quote, numerous witnesses, end quote, had observed Bates in the library, though none had spoken to her. The Press, a local Riverside newspaper, carried 2 stories about the attack on the day after Bates was found. In the first, information about the discovery of the body was shared with the public. Bates was identified by name, and her father's name and address were listed. The naive standard of an innocent time, quote, Joseph Bates, 4195 Via San Jose, end quote. The article noted that the area of the crime had to be roped off because students were beginning to arrive for classes. Officer J. Walters was pictured looking for clues. In a separate picture, Officer Ben Castleberry interrogated librarian Harry Back and reference librarian Winifred Turner about the library's hours of operation. The story noted that officers carefully circumnavigated the pathway, preventing the destruction of any forensic material until it had been processed. The second article, titled, quote, Father Waits in Vain for Daughter's Return, end quote, told the heart-wrenching story of Sherry Joe's dad. By Monday morning, Joseph knew that a body had been found at RCC and that Sherry Joe's Volkswagen, with California license plate PNA-398, had been discovered nearby. Police didn't say anything to him at first, but he suspected that the remains were those of his only daughter. The police eventually notified him of what he already knew. He was now very alone. On Tuesday, Gren informed reporters that the detectives had interviewed 75 people, but still had not solved the riddle. Quote, "So far, we have drawn a blank." End quote. He asked for public assistance from anyone who had seen Bates before her demise, hoping that knowledge of her movements and activities of Sunday night would aid the investigation. Tips flooded in. Everyone wanted to help, it seemed. When the public was told of the small blade that was used against the popular young co-ed, telephone calls came in from people all over town who had located just such a knife. On November 14, the campus gardener raked up a small knife on the college grounds. Unfortunately, for the investigation, it had no dried blood on it, and the size was wrong. It was reported that one witness had seen Bates as she drove toward the library on the day she went missing. A 1965 or 1966 bronze-colored car, possibly an Oldsmobile, had been observed following her. No one else could confirm the sighting, and no such vehicle was ever positively identified. Riverside Police Chief Kincaid revealed on Wednesday that nearly 125 citizens had been interviewed by police, who were working the murder case around the clock. In the aftermath of the attack, RCC illuminated and provided open space at the spot the crime had occurred. Facing pressure from the community, it moved up its schedule to install mercury vapor lights on the campus between Terracina Drive and Fairfax Avenue. The few pieces of physical evidence found at the scene of the murder intrigued investigators. A heel print in the soil from a military shoe, sized between 8 and 10, appeared to come from her attacker. It was identified as a B.F. Goodrich waffle design, a men's 4/8 inch washer-type half-heel. At first it appeared that the shoes made the impression originated in England. Subsequent investigation indicated that they were sold only to Federal Prison Industries at Leavenworth, Kansas, where they were cobbled with leather into shoes for the U.S. government. The pair that made the impressions in the soft ground could have been purchased at nearby March Air Force Base, a strategic air command base. Shoes bearing the identified tread patterns were also available to other government agencies, including prison administrations. A man's Timex watch, with the fastener on one side of the watch torn off, may have also been deposited by her attacker. It had a white stainless steel face and no serial number. Located 10 feet from Bates' body, with its hands stopped at precisely 12:24. The watch may have been pulled from her killer during the struggle. It was later determined that the watch had been purchased from a PX at an overseas military base. This resulted in the interrogation of 154 airmen stationed at March Air Force Base, all those who took classes at the college. The Timex was sent on Thursday to the California Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation, CII, in Sacramento, and subjected to many tests by a private company in San Diego. A summary of the crime 5 years later indicated that the police were convinced that the watch belonged to her murderer, but they also knew it could have been totally unrelated to the attack or purposefully placed by her attacker as a false clue. If it was worn by Bates' killer, the police had one more piece of information about him. He had a 7-inch wrist. The watch was dotted with white paint spatter, an intriguing potential clue to the owner's identity. The investigation also turned up a discarded cigarette butt near the site of the murder. Law enforcement never determined whether it was related to Bates' death or was deposited by someone totally unconnected to the case. The police soon realized that they did not have much concrete evidence from the site of the murder, but would have to somehow move the case forward nevertheless. A murder investigation usually begins with a careful evaluation of the crime scene. It proceeds with a comprehensive study of the victim, and then continues outward in ever-expanding concentric circles of the victim's social relationships. A crime scene analysis, an integral part of any investigation, makes two important assumptions stemming from what is known in criminology as the Locard transfer principle, articulated by Dr. Edmund Locard. Quote, "Every contact leaves a trace." End quote. The first assumption is that when anyone commits a crime, he or she will inevitably leave something of him or herself behind at the scene, such as a head hair, fingerprint, or trace fiber. It is not possible for someone to inhabit a place without leaving some evidence of the visit, however small. The question is whether scientific investigative means are available to record and document the evidence before it is destroyed or contaminated. The second assumption is a corollary. Every perpetrator of a crime takes something with him or her from a crime scene, whether it be microscopic traces of the environment, such as soil, vegetation, or water samples, some portion of the victim, such as bodily fluids, a hair, or clothing fibers, or something brought to the scene by the victim or someone else. If a suspect can be identified soon enough, evidence of his or her presence can be preserved and presented in a court of law. In an investigation, the crime scene evidence may aid investigators in developing the rudimentary beginnings of a profile. The police want to know what type of person might feel comfortable operating in such an environment, and what about the crime scene itself may have led to the crime. Since the scene can reveal what is likely or possible for the criminal behavior, a good investigator will linger, attempting to understand as much about it as possible. While the investigators in 1966 lacked any modern investigative techniques, they were able to develop a rough profile of their suspect. Criminal profiling is as old as investigation. It is an attempt to describe as accurately as possible what is known or can be inferred about an unknown offender. It will incorporate eyewitness reports and any details of the perpetrator's known physical properties in an effort to eliminate suspects so that law enforcement can focus its attention on a smaller set of likely candidates. Psychological profiling, the activity that attempts to describe the psychological makeup of the offender from the crime scene evidence, dates back to the 1950s. It was unavailable to the investigation at the time of the murder, however, and would not gain widespread acceptance until published papers on the subject began appearing in reputable journals in the 1970s. The investigators dutifully took a close look at Bates' life. Victimology, the study of the victim of a crime, often provides clues as to what happened, but why it happened. If the victim is present in some high-risk category, such as a drug-using prostitute or an unknown member of a violent gang, an analysis of the risks may suggest a motive for the killing. A victimology may also indicate who was responsible, or at least the type of person who would be considered. A low-risk victim, such as a well-liked member of the community who does not engage in unlawful behavior, may suggest that the killer may be closer to home, an intimate friend or a spouse. The police were confident in their assessment that Sherry Joe was very low risk in her actions and lifestyle. She did not move in violent crowds, break the law, or use drugs. Her victimology did not suggest a motive for death. In only one respect was she at an elevated risk at all. She was young and attractive. Eyesome females run an increased chance of violent death at the hands of lovers, ex-lovers, and wannabe lovers in all too frequently played-out scenarios of fatal revenge, spite, or misdirected passion. The Riverside police were well aware that most murder victims are known to their killers. Frequently, the perpetrator is a friend or family member. It is an early step in any investigation to examine and, if possible, clear all close associates. Murder is a deliberate and hostile act, usually having at its root a soured friendship, a broken family tie, a failed business partnership, or love affair gone wrong. The overwhelming majority of murders of young women are committed by boyfriends, husbands, or men who once filled these roles. Sherry Joe was dating at the time of her death. According to newspaper reports, her exclusive partner, Dennis Highland, had left the area to attend San Francisco State College after studying at RCC. The weekend prior to her death, Sherry Jo had joined Hyland's parents on a trip to visit him at the Northern California campus. The trip went well by all accounts. Sherry Jo and Dennis were very much in love. Hyland was questioned and cleared quite quickly. He was far away from Riverside at the time of the murder, and had no apparent motive to kill his girlfriend, even if he had been in the area. Early on, in the initial fog of the murder, two friends of Sherry Jo's told police that their friend had gone to the library to meet her boyfriend. Further investigation eliminated this possibility. Captain Cross reported on Thursday that the information was based on hearsay and was incorrect. By this time, nearly 200 people had been questioned. The Tiger Times, the RCC newspaper, in a story published 5 days after the attack, quote, "Police still lack clues in the murder," end quote, noted that the police had no suspects. The tentatively held theory was that the killer disabled Bates' car, then waited for her in one of the driveways on Terracina Drive. The paper indicated that Bates, quote, "put up a tremendous struggle," end quote, in her valiant, though ultimately unsuccessful, attempt to survive. It also reported that there was an increase in students who dropped night classes, but added that, according to John Matalik, the dean of admissions, this may have been prompted by other factors, including a drop class deadline. Exactly 2 weeks after the murder, according to several sources, the police staged a reenactment of sorts. They invited everyone who had been at the library on the night that Bates was killed to reassemble. Participants were told to wear the same clothes they had worn, park in the same space in which they had parked, and sit at the same desk they had occupied that night. Each of the 65 participants was questioned and asked to give a statement as to what they had seen and done a fortnight earlier. Further, the men were fingerprinted and asked for a lock of their hair. The color of the hair found on Bates' thumb was initially withheld from the public. Everyone willingly agreed to the requests to help locate Bates' killer. Through the reenactment, it was concluded that Bates, or a woman who looked like her, had arrived at the library at 5:40 p.m. and waited until it opened at 6 p.m. Captain Cross announced that the police sought a 1947 to 1952 Studebaker with light-colored oxidized paint. One had been seen by students at 7 p.m. on the night of the murder, but it had not been present for the reenactment 2 weeks later. Also, police were looking for a heavy-set man with a beard. He, too, had been observed at the library, but had failed to return. By December 1, no strong suspect or suspects had been developed. Many people brought to the attention of law enforcement had been investigated. One man moved south immediately following the murder. Further investigation eliminated him from suspicion. A mental patient at a nearby state hospital reported that he might have killed the petite beauty. He was found to be subject to delusions and hallucinations and not responsible for the murder. Because the attack closely resembled an April 1965 stabbing of another co-ed in a spot not far from where Bates was found, investigators moved quickly to find the assailant of the earlier violence. The 19-year-old was cleared as soon as he was located. He was still serving time for that attempted murder when Bates was stabbed and therefore could not have been responsible. Investigators clearly analyzed the evidence. Drops of dried blood found in a driveway suggested that the killer had returned to Terracina Drive after completing the injuries to Bates. It was also possible that Bates was stabbed at or near her car and then shed these drops as she fled for her life to the promise of safety among the abandoned homes. Captain Cross initially speculated that the victim had sprinted from the library, noting that scuff marks were found in the gravel along the driveway. His suspicions were revised with the discovery of footprints leading to the crime scene that suggested instead that Bates had gone willingly, unaware of what awaited her, as a lamb to the slaughter. The right window of Bates' car was partially open, leading investigators to wonder whether she had been approached at some point in the ordeal from the passenger side of her vehicle. The odd condition of her car puzzled investigators. Through interviews, They learned that she loved her vehicle and worked very hard to pay for it. She never left it, they were told, until it had been carefully locked and its windows dutifully rolled up. They could not account for the unlocked doors, the unrolled windows, and the key thoughtlessly abandoned in the ignition. They speculated that she knew her attacker and was comfortable enough to let her guard down and leave with him. This was reinforced by the knowledge that Bates was afraid of the dark. Because that Sunday was the first day of the return to Pacific Standard Time, the city was dark at 6:15 p.m. Investigators believed that she would only have ventured between the two dilapidated campus homes with someone she highly trusted. As the Riverside Police Department strove to understand what had happened to Bates and locate a perpetrator, the idea of a serial killer was never considered. This was a single murder, unconnected to any other crime at this point. Additionally, the term, quote, serial killer, end quote, would not be coined and in common use for another decade or so. Only traditional motives for the killing were explored because those were all the categories that existed in the minds and training of investigators. In 1966, they had no other arrows in their investigative quivers. Murder for financial gain was quickly eliminated when Bates' purse was located under her body, its contents, including cash, completely undisturbed. Investigators also ruled out a sexual attack because the girl's clothing was unmolested and no semen or other evidence was present to suggest such a motive. They considered and rejected other common motives and were left wondering whether it was a drug-related murder, a revenge killing, or a spur-of-the-moment attack committed by a perpetrator in a psychotic fit of rage. Further investigation failed to reveal any known enemies or any hint of a drug or organized crime connection in Bates' life. A few fingerprints were collected and sent to CII in Sacramento on November 4, specifically the latent fingerprint section. The file became latent case number 73096. Further analysis would eliminate all but 4 fingerprints and 3 partial palm prints, which were never matched to anyone. On November 9, a preliminary report was filed with the Riverside County District Attorney's Office, and nail scrapings, vaginal smears, and hairs from the base of Bates' right thumb were processed for analysis. Despite the physical evidence, the investigation soon sputtered for lack of motive, any real suspects, or a single eyewitness. The police were left to scratch their heads at this most mysterious, senseless killing. One fact regarding the murder seemed clear. If Bates' attacker planned to kill her, he was a novitiate in murdering with a knife. The 3.5-inch by 1/2-inch blade was not nearly sufficient for a clean and efficient kill, and it allowed his victim to put up a noble struggle. If he were to murder again with a knife, he would know to bring something larger, much larger. If the attack was unplanned, perhaps an intended sexual assault that got out of hand, or the perpetrator impulsively reacted with violence to some unexpected psychological trigger, and knowing what we know now, perhaps the killer enjoyed his first taste of blood and made the decision that this would not be his last. The murder investigation, case number 352-481, would eventually go as cold as Bates' lifeless body. No one could be found who had a reason to kill the young co-ed, and Bates did not engage in any high-risk behaviors that would suggest a motive. Friends and family members were questioned and cleared. Not only were the members of her closest circle not responsible, no one seemed to know by whom or for what purpose their much-loved Sherry Joe was murdered.
A cryptic poem, a signature that looked like a Z, and an eerie promise of more deaths to come. Was the Riverside Killer laying the groundwork for something even bigger? The search for answers was just beginning.